Knocky 9 doors. This all happened so long ago that sometimes I wonder if it happened at all. I don't mean the basic stuff, the silly antics of a bunch of kids, the way we got into trouble, that kind of thing. No, it's the darker side of the story that I have problems with. How much did I imagine at the time? How much has my mind embroidered and generally tinkered with down the decades? Am I, in fact, going a bit gaga in my old age? I've long suspected that the human memory is about as reliable as a car mechanic who tells you, "It'll be ready Thursday, swear on me mother's grave." Memory is a rogue and a vagabond. But yesterday I read something that upset me, and I can't get it out of my head. Perhaps, as Lillian keeps telling me, writing can be a form of therapy. Lillian is one of the ladies who sit at my table at lunchtime. You're always grateful for intelligent company at the day centre, and she's still very sharp, though she's nearly 90. She was the one who suggested setting up a little readers group, and later chivied us on to creative writing. But for all her intelligence and kindness, I'm not sure if I would ever dare tell her this tale. I'll just write it down, and read it back to myself as if it were some random sensible person coming to it cold. Then we shall see. It was a long, hot summer in my old hometown, which lies on the northeast coast. I moved away, and stayed away, when I went to university. It was pretty much dead by the time I was 18. A zombie town, what the Americans call Rust Belt. When I was 12, when this story happened, it was still busy with shipbuilding, mining, and other heavy industry, but the writing was on the wall. My dad, a man I always recall as a large, benevolent presence, worked in a factory making cranes. He liked football and fishing, and played a good game of darts. He was one of the kindest human beings I've ever known. He was also one of those men who occupied a room simply by sitting in his armchair in the corner, opposite the telly. Occupied the house, really, in a good way. The place, though hardly large, seemed vacant and bleak without him. My mother was a small, dark-eyed woman who worked at the local building society. She was good with money, and a terrible cook, who hated the kitchen and domesticity in general. She loved reading, and would get me books from the grown-up section of the library with her ticket, Jules Verne, H.G. Wells, and some other classics she felt I should know. Mam was the dynamic force in the household, while Dad's quiet solidity kept the ship on an even keel. Working-class men were often managed by their wives. It was part of the culture then, and maybe some still are. Every Friday Dad would lay his pay packet on the kitchen table. Mam would take most of it for housekeeping, bills, etc. Then she'd give him back his spending money for the working men's club. Me, I was bespectacled, thin, not yet spotty, but the hormones were on order. I loved horror films and Doctor Who, starring John Pertwee, if you want to date this story. I was developing a slightly furtive interest in glam rock. Mam disapproved of the latter because those boys look like girls and they can't sing properly. But my marks at school were good, so she confined her criticism to asides and frequent tutting. Dad looked on benevolently, a little confused by my tastes, but never judging or mocking. Looking back on it, it was a happy childhood, by and large. Except for Mr. Woodruff. Before I tell you about him, I should explain that our street had not escaped the attentions of the Luftwaffe, and as a result there was a gap. We called it the Bommy, short for bomb site. The house had been hit by a German aiming for the shipyards half a mile further north, and the building had been pulled down. It was common for streets in big industrial towns to have this gap-toothed look well into the second half of the century. The point is that the Bommy had left the end house at the top of the street standing alone, like a haunted house in any number of stories, and it was there that old Woodruff lived. According to my mam, he was a miserable old bugger. Dad tended to agree, but he also told me a few times that old people living alone can be eccentric and bad-tempered, and I should take that into account. I'm not sure I did, and certainly not when I was out with the gang, and you won't be surprised to learn that me and my pals had theories about Mr. Woodruff. None were complimentary. Baz, who was our leader most of the time, speculated that Woodruff had been a Nazi spy and might now be working for the Kremlin. How he'd made that change of employment was always a little murky, but as evidence Baz pointed to the fact that Woodruff seemed to be up late at night, judging by the lights in his windows. That was the kind of time, according to Baz, that a spy might be on the radio to the Soviet Union, because the time zones were different there. His auntie Val, who lived on the other side of the bommy, had apparently heard the old man talking loudly and not in English. She couldn't say what the language was. Baz reckoned it was Russian. Another leap of schoolboy logic there. The youngest and smallest of us, Mark, preferred to think the old man was a vampire. You could see his point. Woodruff was cadaverous, tall, and habitually dressed in black. He also had deep-set black eyes that seemed to look right through you, like Christopher Lee's. But, as Mark's older sister Denise pointed out, vampires didn't come out in daylight. Woodruff was often seen at the co-op, loading up his trolley with assorted tins and a sliced loaf. The thought of a vampire tucking into spaghetti hoops on toast was a bit much. I preferred the mad scientist theory. I suggested that Woodruff was assembling a monster in his cellar. In evidence, I pointed out that he often received parcels from abroad. Sometimes these were just big, heavy books. The local postie was a chatty bloke, and he could feel the shape. But at other times, Woodruff got odder items, very well-wrapped packages that sometimes gave off a weird smell. Once there'd been an incident with one of those parcels at the sorting office. It had been dropped, and some horrible black stuff had oozed out. They'd called in hygiene inspectors from the council just in case. Nobody knew exactly what the truth was, but it seemed Woodruff had some pull with the council and the police, as the strange parcels kept arriving. There was one minor problem with the mad scientist theory, though. None of these houses have cellars, Denise pointed out. Where would he do his experiments? There's no room to make a proper monster. He might have had a cellar dug like, I replied a little truculently. How would we know? Even I felt that was a bit feeble. Deep down, I think we all accepted the grown-ups' view of Woodruff as a grumpy old josser. It was just fun to think that he might be something else. Speculating about him livened up the dull routine of school and telly and bank holidays in Whitley Bay. Anyway, we weren't nice to the grumpy old man, and he didn't like us, so we thought badly of him in creative ways. He complained about the noise younger kids made playing on and around the bommy, and the older kids, who sometimes hung around on the corner smoking and messing about. Many a football went over the wall into his backyard, only to be hurled back out with fatal puncture wounds. That kind of thing had prompted at least one stand-up row with an irate parent, but these didn't amount to much. He was within his rights to complain about noise, and as for the footballs, the wiser kids played their games at the other end of the back lane. But during the long hot summer I'm thinking of, our little gang found themselves constantly at odds with Woodruff. It was as if something was making us blunder into situations where we'd annoy him. Things came to a head when we got so bored on the third week of the school holidays that we decided to play Knocky 9 Doors. You may not know it. I've looked it up. Yes, pensioners can Google, and I've found it has a lot of names. But the way we played it was hardcore, as the youngsters say nowadays. You see, the basic principle's simple. You knock on a door and run away, but you don't just scarper like a coward. No. The point of the game is to knock on one door, then another, and eventually do the whole 9 houses without getting caught. Not easy. And it was a lot harder when you played it properly, meaning the way Baz insisted it should be played. Because then you had to knock on the first door once, the second door twice, the third 3 times. You get the picture. By the time you'd done 9, the chances of you escaping without somebody clocking you were very slender. The dreaded threat of, "I know your dad," would be shouted. Or in my case, "I know your mam." And that was it. You were in for it. Well, on this particular occasion, we'd had an argument about a trivial matter, something so unimportant I can't remember it. I can recall Baz getting red in the face at my contradicting him. It might have been about which Thunderbird was piloted by which Tracy brother, or whether a Spitfire was faster than a mosquito, something that seemed absolutely crucial at the time. It had been one of those hot, sticky days when you can never get comfortable, a day without a cloud in the sky, but somehow you can't take any joy in it. It was bickering weather. Whatever the reason, Baz challenged me to a duel. Not a fight, we weren't a violent lot, unlike some. No, he said if I was so sure of myself, I'd go through this thing called trial by ordeal that Mr. Pickersgill had once told us about in history. If somebody in olden times had been accused of a crime, they could carry a red-hot metal bar a dozen paces, or do something equally hard. If they could do it, they'd be let off. I agreed, like an idiot. A hot, tired, quarrelsome idiot. Baz challenged me to Knocky 9 Doors as our ordeal. This prompted another argument about how to go about it. Logically, we should have both faced exactly the same ordeal, but doing it twice in the same street? No sense in that. So we all agreed, after about 3 minutes of renewed bickering, to toss a coin. The winner got to choose which streets the challengers had to do. I won. I chose Royston Street, which was quiet, and I allocated my own street to Baz. "I'll go first," he said, with typical bravado. I expected him to start at the bottom end, near the main road, but he just walked away from our group and headed uphill. I realised that at the top, where Woodruff's house was, there were usually fewer people about. Baz would, I assumed, knock once at Woodruff's, belt past the bommy, then do the rest. It would be much easier running downhill, especially in the blistering sun. But no, I was wrong again. To this day I can't think what possessed him, but Baz started 8 doors short of the bomb site. No! I remember Denise gasping out the word. I can still recall the sinking sensation in my stomach as I saw Baz's sturdy frame pause outside a nondescript door and knock once. It was good and loud, echoing in the overheated air as he sprinted for the next door up. 2 raps on the knocker, then he was on to the third, which had a doorbell. We didn't hear that, but we heard the fourth just as the first door opened and a head looked out, briefly. I saw a pale face. The woman was looking down the street at us. Then she put her head in just as Baz reached the 5th door. Her head popped out again, and I think I heard a faint expletive before she went inside a second time and slammed her door. It was probably the hot weather and the mid-afternoon timing that let Baz get away with it, as far as he did. Most people were on holiday or in the park if they weren't at work, like my folks. Normally, we'd have all felt relieved when he neared the end of his run, but instead, as he ran past the bomb site, I felt my throat tightening. 9 knocks. I think we all stopped breathing. The first knock echoed down the street, and the next one was hard on its heels. It was a staccato sound and seemed far too loud given the distance. It was as if the world had gone silent, apart from the one boy rapping on that door with his knuckles. 6, 7, 8. Denise was counting. I knew I expected Woodruff to burst out of that door before 9, with Baz stumbling forward into the old man's arms. What I thought might happen next, I don't know. Nothing good, obviously. But Baz got to 9. I remembered to take a breath as he turned to face us and started to run down the road, waving casually as if it was no big deal. Then the old man's head appeared. Denise gave a little scream, and I think I shouted something, urging my friend on. I'd forgotten the whole stupid argument by then, of course. Baz must have realised what had happened, and he just kept running. Woodruff stepped out onto the pavement, shaking his fist and screaming something. We were giggling at this point from sheer relief. Sure, Woodruff would complain about us, but so what? A clip round the ear for Baz would be the worst that could happen. That was what we thought. But then Woodruff stopped screeching and shaking his fist. He crumpled up in the doorway and started sliding to the ground. "He's fainted," I said, or something like that. Baz must have seen our expressions change. He slowed down and turned his head. Woodruff was kneeling on the pavement now, mouth gaping wide, straggling grey hair falling over his face. His eyes were hidden in shadow. Then he collapsed, face down, and we were left staring at what might have been a heap of old clothes lying in the blazing sun. "Is he faking it?" Baz asked that, I'm sure, but I couldn't see anyone faking a faint so perfectly. That heap of shabby, mismatched clothes was not moving. We all stood gulping as Baz slowed down, huffing and puffing and red-faced, then stopped. He turned to look properly. We all expected him to make a decision, our sort of leader, but he didn't seem to know what to do. It would have been easy if anyone else had been lying there. We weren't bad kids. Somebody needed help, we'd try and help. But this was Woodruff, and we'd been up to no good, so we hesitated. Just for a few seconds, sure, but we stood there, doing nothing, just looking. And then the heap of clothes moved, just a little, but enough to be noticeable from the other end of the street. "He could be dying," said Denise, and looked at me. It was my street, of course, which somehow made me responsible. I'll never understand why, but I went along with it. "We can call 999, I said, and started running up the street to our house. Our house was about halfway up on the same side as Woodruff's, so I got closer to that slumped figure as I ran. And I'm sure he was looking right at me, those deep-set eyes taking it all in. The others followed me inside. No one even suggested going to check on the old man. Again, if it had been anyone else, Denise at least would have been kneeling by them, trying to put her first aid training from guides into effect. but not Woodruff. My memories of the next hour or so are fragmentary, strange. I recall big men in uniforms asking questions, taking it all in their stride, and a shrouded form being loaded into an ambulance. Then my mother was suddenly there, asking more questions, defensive on my behalf. Other parents arrived, along with the usual clumps of gossips and gawpers assembled in the street. Woodruff was dead. Heart attack was the likely cause. There was an inquest, and the facts about the dare came out well before then. We might have been in trouble if an ordinary bloke had died, but by the time the coroner got involved, things had changed. Woodruff had no relatives, it seemed, nobody to arrange things. There was a pauper's funeral. Before that, though, the police looked inside the house. What they found was reported in the local paper as human remains. According to Baz's cousin, who was a copper, there were skulls and bones and less identifiable things, some of them preserved in jars. Baz talked about eyeballs. A lot. Whatever the truth of it, by the time the inquest came around, many people felt we'd done a public service. Nobody said it in so many words, but you get to know what adults think about something when you're a kid. You pick up overheard snatches of conversation, significant looks, and sudden silences. And that would have been the end of it. The house was cleared out, and I have no idea where the books and other things went. Burned or buried, I hope. Summer changed to autumn, we went back to school, and Woodruff's house lay empty. Nobody wanted to buy it, despite it being a bigger-than-average place for the neighbourhood. Then the knocking began. At first it was just a nuisance. Dad, who got up early for work, mentioned to Mam that some idiot had been knocking at the crack of dawn. Went out to look, nobody there. Then other members of the gang mentioned knocking at various times. Baz claimed it was somebody messing with us, knowing about the incident. It had been in all the papers. There were kids at school who might have done it. But the fact that it happened at random times seemed odd. And why would anybody persist with a joke that wasn't even funny? It was in winter, just a couple of weeks before Christmas, that the next thing happened. There'd been a heavy fall of snow on Friday night, and more flurries throughout the weekend. Even though it got dirty and trampled down quickly, there was still a good covering. I had a small sled Dad had made me years before at work. It was a bit on the small side for us now, but in a way that added to the fun. It looked comical, and we fell off quite often. Mark, being the smallest, was the least likely to take a tumble, while Baz seldom survived a whole run. Now, we'd normally not have used the pavement on what had been Woodruff's side of the street, but the snow was better there. The other side was mostly grey slush. At first we started our run at the lower end of the bommy. Nobody said anything, we just didn't go near that house. But of course, we wanted to get at more speed as time passed on, so eventually we ended up pulling the sled up to the solitary house at the top of the street. I think the combination of excitement and the passage of time had made us less wary of the place. It so happened that Baz was at the top of the street with the sled while the rest of us were waiting at the bottom. It was my turn next, I think. Anyway, we were in the same positions more or less as we had been on that fateful summer afternoon. Snow had started falling again a minute or two earlier, and a freezing wind was blowing the flakes into our faces. 1 minute I saw Baz trying to balance his hefty self on the little red-painted sled. I think I said something like, "He'll never make it." Then a flurry of snow blinded me for a couple of seconds, and Denise screamed. The next thing I knew, Baz was sliding down the street, sprawled out on his back, legs splayed, arms dragging. There was a trail of bright red patches on the snow behind the sled. Then it slewed sideways and Baz was hurled onto the pavement. He just lay there, face down. We didn't hesitate this time, of course. When we got to him, the dirty snow around his head was darkening. I didn't dare turn him over, but Denise did. I'll never forget his eyes. Their absence, rather. Mark was crying. Denise looked up at me and asked if I'd seen it. I think I just stared. It was black and all raggy, she stammered. Oh, God, it was so thin. A 9 days wonder. That's what they called it. The kids in the Knocky 9 Doors case were back in the news. The police naturally thought we'd attacked Baz for some reason, but they couldn't find a motive, a weapon, or anything else to support that. The cause of death was problematic too. Blood loss wasn't enough, the coroner said. Shock seemed to be to blame. Baz's family moved away not long after. The death disrupted all our lives, of course, and it was one of the things that soured me on my hometown. Like I said, I got out as soon as I could. Denise did too. Went into nursing, moved to Edinburgh, got married, I believe. Mark had some problems, in and out of institutions. I lost track of them, both. And that would be the end of the story, if it weren't for something I stumbled over the other day. I'm a silver surfer, a bit clumsy and slow, but I do my best to keep up. Occasionally, I check a local news site for my hometown. 9 times out of 10 there's nothing interesting. But yesterday, I saw something that kept me awake most of the night. Bizarre finds in haunted house. I knew which house it meant, but I hoped I was wrong. The street name confirmed it, though. It seemed that the Woodruff place was finally pulled down after years of neglect. Nobody would live in it for long. A succession of landlords had discovered that to their loss. I skimmed the story at first. There were many reports down the years of noises and things seen. Even the most impoverished students wouldn't stay in the house at the top of the street, and eventually the owner had given up. And anyway, time, the elements, and vandalism had made the place officially uninhabitable. The demolition crew found something in one of the walls. It was described as a small jar hidden in the gap between the usual 2 layers of Edwardian brickwork. A folklore expert from the local history society had claimed it was a witch bottle designed to fend off evil. When it was opened, it had produced such a foul odour that one person present needed medical attention. I don't believe it was a charm against evil. I think it preserved it and localised it, kept it bound to that particular house, the old man's stamping ground. I formed that opinion this morning when the knocking woke me from a fitful doze. I can't be sure how many knocks there were, but I can hazard a guess.